The family meeting was called for a Sunday at 2 p.m. at my parents' house, and I knew before I walked in the door what it was about because my cousin Lena had texted me the night before and said they're going to say Grandpa Walter changed his will before he died. They have a document. What they did not know, what nobody in that living room knew, was that I had spent the previous 11 days on the phone with Walter's attorney, a woman named Barbara Cline, who had been drafting estate documents in Cabell County, West Virginia for 31 years, and who had, when I called her, said, "I wondered when you were going to call." What Barbara Cline told me, and what she put in writing, and what I carried in a manila folder to that Sunday meeting in my parents' living room, was the reason that when my father unfolded the document he had prepared and said, "Your grandfather changed his will 3 weeks before he died. He left the property to the family trust, not to you, specifically," I was able to open my folder and set 4 pages on the coffee table and say, "I know you believe that. I'd like you to read what Barbara Cline wrote before we go any further." My father read the first paragraph. His face did a thing I had never seen it do before. Not anger, not surprise, but the specific stillness of a man who has been running toward a door and has just realized the door opens the other direction. My mother said, "What is that?" I said, "It's the original will, notarized in 2019, with Barbara Cline's attestation that no subsequent document was ever brought to her for execution." I said, "And the second page is a sworn statement from the Cabell County Register of Deeds, confirming that no other will or amendment in Walter Braddock's name has been filed in this county in the past 15 years. My Uncle Raymond, who had been sitting very still in the corner chair, stood up and walked out of the room. My Aunt Linda said nothing. My father set the document he had prepared on the coffee table beside mine and did not pick it up again. The meeting that had been called to take something from me was over in 7 minutes. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Petra Braddock. I'm 33 years old. I am an archivist and records manager for a regional historical preservation organization in Charleston, West Virginia. My entire professional life is the management of documentation, the finding, preserving, and verifying of records that establish what happened when it happened and what was agreed. I mention this because it is the reason that when my grandfather Walter died, and something started to feel wrong in the weeks that followed, I did not wait for someone to explain it to me. I went looking, and what I found is why a family meeting lasted 7 minutes, and why an uncle walked out of a room, and why a document my father had prepared never got read past the first paragraph. This is the story of what Walter left me, what my family tried to do with it, and what happens when the person you underestimate has spent 10 years learning how to prove what is true. Let me take you back to Huntington, West Virginia, the river town at the western edge of the state, where the Ohio River bends and the bridge to Kentucky is visible from the bluffs, and the economy has spent 40 years in the specific process of becoming something different from what it was. My grandfather Walter Braddock had lived on Altizer Avenue in the same house since 1971, a white frame house with a deep front porch and a yard that backed up to a neighbor's garden, the kind of house that accumulates history the way certain people accumulate it, quietly, specifically, without calling attention to itself. Walter had worked for 32 years at the Norfolk Southern Rail Yard in Huntington, retiring in 1998 with a pension that was modest but sufficient, and with the specific contentment of a man who had never wanted what he didn't have. He was 79 when he died. He had been in decline for 2 years, the steady kind that doesn't have a dramatic moment but moves in one direction and arrives at its destination without asking permission. I want to tell you about Walter because everything that happened after he died makes sense against the background of who he was. Walter Braddock was the person in my family who saw me, not in the performed way, in the operational way, the way that shows up in action rather than sentiment. He had started taking me to the public library on Saturday mornings when I was 5 because my mother worked Saturdays and he was the available adult, and because, as he told me once when I was 10 and asked why, you needed somewhere quiet, and so did I. We had been going to the library together every Saturday. He was in town until I left for college at 18. 13 years. Some weeks we talked the whole time, and some weeks we read separately at the same table, and both arrangements were completely fine with both of us. He taught me to identify primary sources. He taught me the difference between a document and a copy of a document. He taught me that the thing people say about what happened is always less reliable than the thing they signed their name to, which is the foundational principle of archival work, and which I have applied professionally and personally ever since. When I was 22 and graduated from Marshall University with a degree in library science and archival studies, Walter came to the ceremony alone, not because no one else was invited, but because he was the one who asked first and arrived on time and sat in the front section and stood up when I crossed the stage with the specific dignity of a man who had decided that his grandchildren's achievements were worth his full attention. My parents came to the reception afterward. They were warm and present. The difference between Walter's presence and theirs was not warmth. It was witness. Walter was a witness to the specific thing that had happened, and my parents were in attendance. He told me that summer about the property, not the house on Altizer Avenue, a separate property, a 12-acre parcel in Lincoln County that his own father had owned and that had passed to Walter in 1987 when his father died. 12 acres of mixed hardwood and bottomland creek property, not farmable in any serious sense, but significant in the specific way that land in West Virginia is significant. It holds mineral rights, it holds timber rights, it holds the quiet weight of what it means to own a piece of ground in a state whose ground has been extracted and sold and departed for generations by people who came from elsewhere. The Lincoln County property had been appraised at $94,000 in 2018 when Walter had it assessed for estate planning purposes. It was not a fortune. It was the thing Walter had that was worth protecting. He told me he was leaving it to me, not as a surprise, as a statement, the way Walter made statements, directly and without decoration. He said, "I've updated the will with Barbara Cline. The property is yours when I'm gone. Your father has the house and the pension remainder. Your Uncle Raymond and Aunt Linda have the savings account split with your father. The property is yours." I said, "Why me?" He said, "Because you're the one who'll know what to do with it." He said, "And because you've been coming to the library with me for 13 years, and that means something." I said, "It means something to me too." He said, "I know it does. That's why. I want to tell you about my father and Uncle Raymond, because what happened at the family meeting did not come from nowhere. My father, George Braddock, was Walter's older son. He had spent his career in insurance sales in Huntington, built a comfortable life, raised 2 children. He was not a bad man. He was a man organized around the specific conviction that family assets should flow to family in the conventional pattern, parents to children equally, generation to generation, nothing diverted and nothing withheld. He had not known about the Lincoln County property until Walter's estate planning began, and when he found out that it was not going to be split between himself and Raymond, but was instead going to a grandchild, specifically me, he had opinions that he had not shared with me directly, but that I had been aware of in the ambient temperature of family gatherings for 3 years. Uncle Raymond was my father's younger brother, 56 years old, who had spent 15 years telling people he was between projects and who had, in those 15 years, borrowed money from Walter 3 separate times that I knew of and had not repaid any of it. Raymond was the charming one in the family, the way certain people are charming completely and visibly, and in a way that required a specific kind of generosity from everyone around him that he did not reciprocate. He loved Walter in his way. His way was expensive. My Aunt Linda was Raymond's wife and had been navigating Raymond's financial habits for 24 years with the resigned competence of someone who married a man's potential and has been managing the gap between the potential and the man ever since. She was not unkind to me. She was not particularly present either. Walter died in October. The estate process began in November. Barbara Cline notified the relevant parties of the will's provisions. The house to my father. The savings split to my father and Raymond equally. The Lincoln County property to me. Raymond called my father within 48 hours of the notification. I know this because Lena, Raymond's daughter, my cousin, the person who texted me about the meeting, told me with the specific anxiety of someone who is caught between family loyalty and her own sense of what is right. She said, Dad called Uncle George the same night Barbara Cline's letter came. I heard the conversation. He said the will wasn't right. He said Grandpa wouldn't have left the best asset to a grandchild. He said there was a later document. I said, what later document? She said, I don't know. That's what he said. I said, Lena, is there a later document? She said, I don't think so, but I don't know. She said, that's why I'm calling you. I called Barbara Cline the next morning. Not in the afternoon, not at the end of the week, the next morning at 8:15 when her office opened. She answered her own phone. I identified myself. She said, I wondered when you were going to call. She said, I've already had a call from your uncle's attorney. I said, what did his attorney want to know? She said, whether there was a subsequent will or codicil. I said, was there? She said, no. She said, I drafted Walter's will in 2019. He reviewed it with me in 2021 and confirmed he wanted no changes. He was in my office for 45 minutes, and I have detailed notes. He was entirely clear about his intentions. She said, I have never prepared or received any document purporting to amend or supersede the 2019 will. She said, what I have seen in 31 years of this work is the production of documents after the fact by people who expected a different outcome. She said, I want to be precise about what I'm telling you. I am telling you that no legitimate amendment exists. I am also telling you to be prepared for the possibility that something may be presented as if one does. I said, how would I prove that a document is not legitimate? She said, with the original. She said, and with a statement from me. She said, would you like me to prepare one? I said, yes, and I'd like to know what else I should have. She said, give me 4 days. I want to pause here and ask you something that I need you to sit with before you answer in the comments. If someone in your family told you the night before a family meeting that a document was going to be produced that you believed was not real, would you have gone to that meeting with your own documentation? Or would you have hoped the meeting would resolve itself without requiring you to be the one who proved what was true? I have asked everyone who knows this story. The room divides every time. Tell me which half you're in. Barbara Cline prepared 4 documents in 4 days. The first was a signed statement from her office attesting that the 2019 will was the only valid testamentary document she had ever prepared for Walter Braddock, and that no subsequent instrument had been brought to her for execution. The second was a copy of the 2019 will itself, notarized and certified. The third was a timeline of every communication between her office and Walter Braddock from 2019 through his death, showing no amendment requests, no codicil discussions, no instruction to modify beneficiaries. The fourth was a letter from the Cabell County Register of Deeds, which Barbara had requested on my behalf, confirming that no will, codicil, or testamentary amendment in Walter Braddock's name had been filed with the county in the preceding 15 years. I received the package on a Thursday. I had been building my own supporting documentation in parallel, not duplicating what Barbara had provided, but supplementing it. I had a copy of the property deed in Lincoln County confirming Walter's ownership and the absence of any recorded transfer or lien. I had a copy of the county tax records for the Lincoln County parcel confirming Walter as sole owner through the date of his death. I had a printed timeline of my own, correlating the dates in Barbara's records with dates from my own family communications archive, text messages, emails, phone records, showing when my father and uncle had received the estate notification, and when Raymond's attorney had contacted Barbara's office. I put everything in a manila folder with a tab for each document. I labeled the folder with my grandfather's name and the date. I drove to my parents' house on Sunday at 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes early, which I had calculated as the correct margin for arriving before the room had organized itself against me. My mother let me in. She had the quality she got when she knew something was about to happen and had decided her position was neutral, not warm, not cold, the specific absence of temperature that means someone has chosen not to choose. I said, "Hi, Mom." She said, "Hi, honey." She did not ask about the folder. My father was in the living room with Raymond and Linda. Lena was not there. She had sent me a text that morning that said, "I'm not coming. I can't be part of it, but I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry." I texted back, "You told me that was enough." The room had the arrangement of a meeting that had been set up in advance. My parents' couch against the wall, my father's armchair positioned at an angle that made it implicitly the seat of authority, 2 dining chairs brought in for Raymond and Linda, a single seat across from my father. The specific staging of a presentation where one person is meant to receive while the others explain. I did not sit in the receiving seat. I sat in the armchair nearest the door, which was not the chair they had arranged for me, and I set the folder on my knee, and I waited. My father said, "Thanks for coming, Petra." I said, "Of course." He said, "We wanted to do this as a family. There's been some information that's come to light about your grandfather's final wishes." I said, "Okay." He said, "It appears that Walter made some changes to his estate planning in the last months of his life. We have a document." He reached into the folder he was holding, a manila folder, which I noted with the specific professional attention of someone who processes documents for a living, and he removed a single sheet of paper and unfolded it. He said, "This is a codicil to the 2019 will. It was prepared 3 weeks before Walter passed. It modifies the distribution of the Lincoln County property to include it in the family trust rather than as a direct bequest." He extended the document toward me. I did not take it. I said, "May I ask who prepared it?" My father said, "A notary in Lincoln County." I said, "Not Barbara Cline?" He said, "Walter used a different notary for this particular document." I said, "I'd like to see the notary's name." My father said, "It's on the document." He extended it again. I still did not take it. I said, "Before I look at that, I'd like you to read what I've brought." I opened my folder. I removed the 4 pages and the supplementary documentation, and I set them on the coffee table between us, organized and tabbed, the way I set out documents for review at work. I said, "The top page is a signed statement from Barbara Cline attesting that the 2019 will is the only valid testamentary instrument she ever prepared for my grandfather, and that no amendment was ever brought to her office." I said, "The second page is the Register of Deeds confirmation that no will or codicil in Walter Braddock's name has been filed in this county in 15 years. I said, "The third page is Barbara Cline's communication timeline with my grandfather, showing no modification requests." I said, "And the fourth page is the Lincoln County property deed, confirming his ownership without lien or transfer through the date of his death." I said, "I'd like you to read the first paragraph of Barbara Cline's statement before we go any further." My father read it. I watched his face do the thing I described at the beginning, the specific stillness of a man running toward a door that opens the other direction. He read the second paragraph. He set the statement down. He picked up the document he had brought and looked at it for a moment, and then set it on the coffee table beside mine. Uncle Raymond stood up from the dining chair and walked out of the room. He went to the kitchen. I heard water running. He did not come back during the meeting. My Aunt Linda looked at her hands. My mother said, "What is that?" indicating my documentation. I said what I said in the opening of this story. I said, "It's the original will, and the Register of Deeds confirmation, and Barbara Cline's attestation that no other document was ever filed." My father said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "I called Barbara Cline 11 days ago." I said, "She said she had been waiting for me to call." My father looked at the document he had brought. He said, "Raymond found this in Walter's things." I said, "What things?" He said, "Personal papers, in a box at the house." I said, "When did he access the house?" My father said nothing. I said, "Dad, when did Raymond access Walter's house after he died?" My father said, "He went to help your mother, your grandmother, sort things." I said, "My grandmother has been in the memory care facility in Barboursville since 2021. She hasn't lived in the house on Altizer Avenue for 2 years." My father was quiet. I said, "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear all of it." He said, "Okay." I said, "I am not going to tell you what I think the document Raymond found is or isn't. That is for an attorney and potentially a court to determine." I said, "What I am telling you is that Barbara Cline prepared the only valid will, that no amendment was ever filed in this county, that the property was left to me by a man who told me specifically and directly that it was mine and why." I said, "I am not going to sign anything, agree to anything, or participate in any redistribution of this estate based on a document that did not come through the attorney who managed my grandfather's estate." I said, "If Raymond wants to pursue this legally, he is welcome to." I said, "Barbara Cline is prepared to testify. I have 4 pages of documentation, and I am an archivist by profession." I paused. I would think carefully before deciding this is a fight worth having. My father said nothing for a long time. He looked at Raymond's empty chair. He looked at my documentation on the coffee table. He looked at the document he had brought, which was still sitting where he had set it, face down now, as if he had decided he would rather not look at it. He said, "I didn't know where it came from." He said, "Raymond told me it was valid, and I believed him." He said, "I should have called Barbara Cline myself." I said, "Yes." He said, "I should have called you." I said, "Yes." He said, "Petra." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it without qualification. He looked at the documentation, and then at me. "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "The property is mine, Dad." He said, "I know." He said, "I know it is." The meeting was over in 7 minutes. I gathered my documentation. I left the document Raymond had produced on the coffee table because it was not mine, and I did not want to touch it. I said goodbye to my mother, who hugged me at the door, and then held on for an extra moment the way she did when she needed to communicate something she didn't have words for. I walked to my car. I sat in it for a while in my parents' driveway in the November afternoon, the specific gray of a West Virginia November that is not dramatic but is complete, full gray, full cold, the mountains suggesting themselves through the clouds without showing their peaks. I called Barbara Cline's voicemail and left a message that said, "The meeting was this afternoon. Your documentation was everything. Thank you." She called back within the hour. She said, "How did it go?" I said, 7 minutes. She said, "That's about what I expected." She said, "Raymond will likely not pursue it further." I said, "Why?" She said, because the document he produced will not survive scrutiny. I've seen this before. They rarely do. She said, he counted on you not being prepared. She said, he made the wrong calculation. Let me tell you what happened with Raymond. Raymond called my father on Monday. I know this because my father called me on Tuesday and told me. He said, Raymond admitted he found the document in a drawer at the house and added some things. He said it the way people say the thing they cannot believe they are saying, flat, specific, the word strict of inflection because the inflection would make it too large to hold. I said, he altered a document. My father said, he thought Walter meant to make the change, but hadn't gotten around to it. He said he was helping Walter's real intentions. I said, that's document fraud. My father said, I know. I said, Dad, what do you want to do with that? He said, I don't know. He said, he's my brother. I said, I know he is. I said, here is what I can tell you. If Raymond does not pursue any legal claim based on that document, I will let the matter rest. If he pursues it, I will go to Barbara Cline and to whatever legal authority is appropriate, and I will present everything I have. I said, that is his choice to make. My father said, he won't pursue it. I said, then we let it rest. I said, but Dad. He said, yes. I said, the money he borrowed from Walter, the 3 loans. My father said, I know about those. I said, they should come out of his share of the estate. He said, he stopped. He said, yes, you're right. He said, I'll talk to Barbara Cline. I said, good. He said, Petra. I said, yes. He said, you came to that meeting prepared. I said, I always come to meetings prepared. He said, I know. He said, I should have remembered that. I said, you would have saved us both 11 days of phone calls. He made a sound that was close to a laugh, the specific sound of a man who can see what happened clearly enough to find something wry in it. He said, yes. He said, I would have. The estate settled in March. The Lincoln County property transferred to my name via deed, recorded with the Lincoln County Clerk's office. The savings account split between my father and Raymond was reduced by the amount of Raymond's 3 outstanding loans to Walter, $14,300, documented in Walter's own handwriting in a ledger I found in the house on Altizer Avenue when I helped my father close it out in January. Walter had kept the ledger for 40 years. Every loan to every family member, date and amount, and repayment status, in the specific neat handwriting of a man who believed in the record. The ledger is in my archival collection now, in an acid-free box with a label that says, Braddock Walter J., Personal Financial Records. It is the most important document I have ever processed, not for the numbers, for the handwriting. Let me tell you where everyone is now. The Lincoln County property is mine. I have been to it twice since the estate settled, once in the spring when the creek was running, and once in the fall when the hardwoods were turning and the light through the leaves was the particular October light of the West Virginia mountains that is so specific it has its own color, a yellow that is almost gold without quite being it. I have not decided what to do with it. I am not in a hurry. Walter waited 32 years before deciding what to do with it, and he made exactly the right decision in the end. I have time. My father and I have dinner every other month in Huntington. He initiated the first dinner in January with the specific intention of a man who has decided that the correction has to be made in real time rather than in principle. He said at that dinner, I trusted Raymond's account over yours without asking you. He said, I have been doing versions of that your whole life. I said, what do you mean? He said, I mean you have always been the reliable one, the one who figures things out, and I have always assumed that meant you were fine and didn't need me to check. He said, that assumption was wrong. He said, I should have called you the day Barbara Cline's letter came. I said, yes. He said, I want to tell you why I didn't. I said, okay. He said, because if I called you, I would have had to be honest about what I thought Raymond was doing. And I didn't want to see that clearly. He said, I told myself there might be a legitimate document because the alternative was accepting that my brother had done something I couldn't rationalize. He said, that was a failure of honesty that cost you 11 days and a Sunday meeting and the possibility that you might have lost something your grandfather specifically left to you. He said, I'm sorry, Petra. He said it with the specific weight of a man who has thought about what he is saying carefully enough that the words have their full mass. I said, thank you for saying it that way. He said, it's the true version. I said, I know. I said, that's why I'm thanking you. My mother calls on Sundays. She has always called on Sundays. This is not a new thing, but the quality of the calls has changed since November, in the specific way that quality changes when something has been seen that cannot be unseen. She asks about the property. She asks about my work. She asked once carefully what I was planning to do with Walter's ledger, and I told her about the acid-free box and the label, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, he would have liked knowing you were the one who had it. I said, I think he knew I would be. She said, yes. She said, I think he knew a lot of things we didn't give him credit for knowing. I said, he always did. She said, I know. She said, I'm sorry we didn't do better by you in November. I said, you came to the meeting. She said, that's not enough. I said, no. I said, but it's where we are, and we build from here. She said, okay. She said, okay. Raymond has not called me. I have not called Raymond. Lena and I talk every 2 weeks. Our relationship, which was friendly before November and is something different now, the warmer thing that comes from someone choosing honesty over comfort when it costs them something. She said once, I've been thinking about why I called you that night instead of saying nothing. I said, why? She said, because I watched you come to the library with Grandpa Walter every Saturday, and I knew what that meant to him, and I wasn't willing to watch someone take it from you, without saying anything. She said, I didn't have the nerve to be in the room, but I had the nerve to make the call. I said, the call was everything. She said, I know. She said, I wanted you to know why I made it. I said, I'm glad you told me. Barbara Cline retired in April. Not because of this. She had been planning to retire in the spring. She sent me a brief note when she filed the final estate documents on her firm's letterhead. It was a pleasure to work with you on your grandfather's estate. He was a careful man who made careful decisions, and you are the proof of it. I keep the note in my desk at work, flat under the glass, where I can read it without picking it up. It is the second most important document I have ever processed. Here is what I want to say before I go. My grandfather, Walter, understood something that I have been trying to articulate since I was old enough to understand the work he gave me the tools to do. He understood that the record is the truth's most durable form. Not the story, the record. The story can be revised, amended, reframed, presented through a different lens. The record cannot. A deed is a deed. A will is a will. A notarized statement from an attorney who has been doing this for 31 years in Cabell County, West Virginia, is a notarized statement. And it says what it says, and it was prepared at a specific time. And it carries a specific signature. And none of those things can be changed by a document produced from a drawer in a house that has been accessed without authorization. Walter taught me on Saturday mornings in a library on 3rd Avenue in Huntington that the difference between what someone claims happened and what actually happened is always a document. Not sometimes, always. And that the document, when it exists and when it is authentic and when it has been preserved correctly, is the thing that ends the argument, not wins the argument, ends it Those are different. Winning requires a fight. Ending requires a folder. I walked into that meeting with a folder. The meeting ended in 7 minutes. That is the whole lesson. That is the only lesson. The library visits, the 13 years, the archival degree, the career. All of it was a longer way of arriving at what Walter taught me at 5 years old when he showed me the difference between a primary source and a secondary one. The primary source is the thing that happened. The secondary source is what someone says about what happened. When the two disagree, the primary source wins. Every time. If there is something in your family that someone is trying to take from you with a story, I want you to hear this. Find the primary source. Find the document that says what actually happened. Find the Barbara Cline who has been waiting for your call. Show up prepared, specifically and completely, and let the folder do what a folder does when it is built correctly. The meeting will be short. The silence will be full. And the thing your grandfather left you, the thing he told you specifically and directly that it was yours, it will still be yours when you walk out the door. My name is Petra Braddock. I am 33 years old. I am an archivist in Charleston, West Virginia. My parents called a family meeting to take my inheritance. I arrived with 4 pages and 2 supplementary documents organized by tab in a manila folder. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Walter's ledger is in an acid-free box with his name on it. The Lincoln County property is in my name. The October light through the hardwoods on that 12-acre parcel is the specific, almost gold that I cannot describe to anyone who hasn't seen it. I have time to figure out what to do with it. Walter knew I would. Thank you for staying until the very end. If someone in your family tried to use a story to take something that belonged to you, drop a comment. Tell me what you brought to prove it was yours. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment where something is being taken by people who counted on you not being prepared, share it with the person who needs to hear that the folder is the whole argument. Build the folder. Show up early. Let the document do what documents do. Like, subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.